By the time the sun came up over Saipan on January 27, 1945-78, American airmen had less than 9 hours to live. One of the bombers they flew that morning would come home carrying half a tail, 3 engines, and a story that would take the Army Air Force 41 days to understand. Her name was Irish Lassie. At 5:47 in the morning, Lieutenant Lloyd Avery signed his name on the mission board for the 8th time. Outside the operations building, the January air over Saipan was warm and thick with humidity, carrying the smell of aviation gasoline and coral dust. Sunrise was still an hour away. Along the flight line, ground crews moved in the yellow light of portable generators, checking oil lines, loading belts of .50 caliber ammunition, and hanging 12 500-pound bombs in the belly of a Boeing B-29 Superfortress, marked with the letter A and the number 52 painted in white on her vertical stabilizer. Avery was in his early 20s. He was from Long Beach, California. He had flown 7 combat missions to Japan since the 21st Bomber Command began operating from the Marianas in late November, and he had watched other men not come back from every single one of them. Since the second week of December, the 73rd Bomb Wing had lost more than 30 superfortresses to Japanese fighters, flak, weather, and mechanical failure. That number was not printed anywhere on the mission board. It did not have to be. Every pilot in the room could count. He walked back toward Irish Lassie under a black sky that was just beginning to turn grey at the edges. The Superfortress was the most expensive weapon of the war. Each aircraft cost the United States Treasury roughly $600,000, more than a heavy cruiser, more than any bomber ever built by any nation. Her 4 Wright R3T350 radial engines produced enough combined horsepower to lift 32 tons of metal, fuel, and high explosive to an altitude where Japanese fighters, in theory, could not follow. Her defensive armament consisted of 12 .50 caliber machine guns arranged in 4 remote-controlled turrets, plus a 20mm cannon in the tail that most crews had already removed for unreliability. The whole system was coordinated by an electric fire control computer that solved firing solutions no human gunner could calculate by hand. She was pressurized, she was heated, she could carry 10 tons of bombs from Saipan to Tokyo and return. The War Department training manual described her as untouchable at cruising altitude. The men who flew her were beginning to disagree. At the central fire control station behind the wing, Sergeant Jim McHugh climbed into his seat and settled his headset over his ears. McHugh was the senior gunner on Avery's crew. His job was to sit under a plexiglass blister and watch every quadrant of sky at once, coordinating fire from all 4 turrets through a system of remote sights and slaved controls. In the tail compartment, 40 feet behind him and completely isolated, Sergeant Charles Mulligan of Henderson, Kentucky, was already checking his twin 50s, working the charging handles slowly against the pre-dawn cold. In the right blister, Sergeant Marvin Meyer of Boone, Iowa, drank the last of his coffee and watched the crew chief walk the wing one final time. Somewhere over the horizon, 1,500 miles to the northwest, another young officer was preparing for the same morning from the opposite side of the war. He was roughly the same age as Avery. His name was Captain Kobayashi Teruhiko. He was the commanding officer of the 244th Sentai of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force, based at Chofu Airfield on the western outskirts of Tokyo. He was the youngest Sentai commander in the history of the Imperial Japanese Army. He had received his fighter training at Aquino as an instructor, not a combat pilot. He had killed his first B-29 on the 3rd of December, 45 days earlier, and on that same mission 6 of his pilots had rammed American bombers, and all 6 had lived to walk back to the flight line. On the night of the 26th of January, Kobayashi had walked out to the hardstands at Chofu and given an order that no manual described. He told the ground crews to remove the 12.7mm machine guns from 3 of his Kawasaki Ki-61 Heian fighters. He told them to strip out the armor plate behind the pilot's seat. He told them to remove the radios. He told them everything that could be removed had to be removed by dawn. The purpose was altitude. A fully loaded Heian could not reach 30,000 feet before its engine ran out of breath. A stripped Heian could. The Superfortress cruised at 30,000 feet. A pilot without guns, without armor, and without a radio could reach that altitude, aim his fighter at the wing root of a bomber, and hold the stick straight until the two aircraft occupied the same volume of sky. He would probably die. The bomber would probably die also. One young man for 11 young men. $600,000 for one Kawasaki fighter. The mathematics was terrible. The Japanese Army Air Force had run out of every other kind of mathematics. 30 miles to the east, at Narimasu Airfield, the pilots of the 47th Sentai were doing the same calculation with a different aircraft. Their special ramming unit, officially designated the Shinton Seikotai, or Air Superiority Corps, flew stripped-down Nakajima Ki-44 Shoki interceptors that American intelligence had codenamed Tojo. The Ki-44 was faster in the climb than the Heian. It was uglier. Its short wings and blunt nose gave it the silhouette of a barrel with a propeller, and its pilot did not care. The name Shoki translated as Devil Queller, and the men who flew it in the winter of 1945 understood exactly which devil they were expected to quell. Between them, the 244th and the 47th could put roughly 90 serviceable fighters into the sky over Tokyo on any given morning. On the morning of the 27th of January, they would not be alone. Back on Saipan, the primary target for the day was Target 357. Target 357 was the Nakajima Aircraft Company engine plant at Musashino, a suburb about 10 miles west of the Imperial Palace. The plant assembled the Ha-45 Radial, the engine that powered nearly every modern Japanese fighter and bomber then in production. If Musashino stopped making engines, the Japanese Army Air Force would stop flying within 6 months. That was the theory. The 21st Bomber Command had already sent 5 missions against Target 357 since late November. Not one of them had put the plant out of operation. Weather had blocked 3 raids. Jet stream winds at bombing altitude had scattered the bombs of the other 2 across suburbs. The Norden bomb site was never built to handle. The Norden was the finest optical bomb site in the world. It had been designed and tested over the American Midwest at altitudes of 15,000 feet, in still air, on clear days. Over Musashino in January, the wind at 30,000 feet blew from the west, at between 100 and 200 miles per hour. No bombardier alive had been trained for that. At 0600 hours, 76 superfortresses lifted off from Saipan and Tinian and turned north for Japan. 12 of them turned back within the first 3 hours with mechanical problems. That was ordinary. That left 64 bombers climbing steadily toward a target they had failed to destroy 5 times already. Irish Lassie was in the lead formation of the 497th Bomb Group. She would be first over the coast. Nearly 8 hours into the flight, at 29,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, Lieutenant Avery watched the coast of Honshu resolve out of the haze at the top of his windscreen. The clouds ahead were thicker than the weather aircraft had predicted. Musashino was already invisible. In the nose compartment, the bombardier, Lieutenant Gage, adjusted the intervalometer on his bomb rack and waited. In the tail, Mulligan swung his twin 50s slowly through their full range of motion and watched the sky above and behind the formation. In the central fire control blister, Jim McHugh scanned the horizon and felt the aircraft rock gently in the thin, freezing air. The intercom stayed quiet. At Chofu, at Narimasu, at 11 other airfields ringing Tokyo, radar returns from the incoming formation had already reached the interceptor squadrons. Ground crews rolled Ki-44s and Ki-61s and Ki-45s out of camouflaged revetments and lined them up along the runways. Approximately 190 Japanese fighters would attempt to intercept the 27th of January mission. They would fly 984 separate attacks against the American formations before the day was over. 554 of those attacks would be directed at the 17 bombers of the 497th Bomb Group. Irish Lassie's crew did not know the numbers yet. They would learn them the way all soldiers learn numbers, one at a time. At 2 minutes before 2 o'clock in the afternoon, over the coast of Japan at 29,000 feet, Jim McHugh's voice came through the intercom for the first time in almost 20 minutes. He said, 3 o'clock, high. He said about 40 of them. The clouds broke apart under the wing at 1400 hours local time, and the coast of Honshu came up beneath Irish Lassie like the edge of a black and white photograph. Snow lay across the fields west of Hamamatsu. The rivers were frozen at the banks. 29,000 feet below the cabin, a country that had never in its history been successfully invaded by a foreign army stretched toward the horizon in every direction, and 40 Japanese fighters were climbing hard to meet the men who had come to bomb it. Jim McHugh saw them first. He said the words twice before anyone answered him. 3 o'clock, high, about 40 of them. Lieutenant Avery keyed his microphone once and said, "Understood." That was all. In the tail compartment, Sergeant Charles Mulligan pulled the charging handles on his twin 50 caliber machine guns and settled his shoulders against the padding of his seat. He had a private view of the entire back half of the sky. He had spent the last 4 hours watching nothing move against a field of pale grey, and now suddenly everything moved at once. Small black shapes above the horizon. More small black shapes climbing from below. A whole slow constellation rearranging itself into a ship he had learned to recognize in gunnery school at Buckingham Field in Florida a year and a half earlier. The shape was called a wolf pack. At Chofu, 20 minutes earlier, Captain Kobayashi Teruhiko had taken off at the head of 11 Kawasaki Ki-61 Heian fighters and turned east toward the incoming radar contacts. He was leading the interception personally. His stripped-down aircraft climbed faster than the others. He reached 29,000 feet 3 minutes before his wingmen and orbited slowly above the American formation, watching the 17 superfortresses of the 497th Bomb Group cross the coast in a loose diamond pattern below him. Somewhere in that diamond was the bomber he intended to kill. He did not know it was called Irish Lassie. He would not have cared if he had. The first Ka-44 came in from 12 o'clock high at 400 miles an hour. It came from the 47th Sentai out of Narimasu. Its wings were painted dark green. Its cowling was flat grey. It had no radio antenna, no armor plate, and a full belt of 12.7mm ammunition. It would never live long enough to fire. Jim McHugh watched it grow from a dot to a shape to a machine in less than 8 seconds and squeezed his firing button as soon as the ranging pips on his sight closed on the target. The upper forward turret hammered. 450 caliber machine guns, firing at 800 rounds a minute each. Tracers reached out toward the diving Ki-44 and connected. Pieces of engine cowling flew off. Smoke poured from the exhaust stacks. The Japanese fighter did not turn away. It kept coming. Avery saw the shadow cross his windscreen a quarter of a second before impact. The Ki-44 struck Irish Lassie's left wing just outboard of the number 1 engine at a closing speed of 500 miles an hour. Its propeller chewed through the leading edge of the wing and disintegrated. Its engine tore open the nacelle of the Superfortress's number 1, Wright R3350, and ripped the entire cylinder bank out of its mounts. Half of the left aileron sheared off and tumbled away into the freezing air. Half of the left wing flap followed it. The Ki-44's fuselage broke in, 2 above the Superfortress's back, and cartwheeled past the tail, spinning end over end, and then blew up into soft orange bloom at 25,000 feet. Irish Lassie shuddered along her whole length like a struck bell. Avery felt the yoke buck against his hands. The airplane wanted to roll left. He braced his right foot against the rudder pedal, pushed the yoke into the direction of the roll, and held it there. Every warning light on the flight engineer's panel came on at once. Number 1 engine fire. Number 1 oil pressure 0. Number 1 fuel line severed. Number 1 propeller runaway, he said. Hold the bomb run. He said it once, calmly, over the intercom. In the nose compartment, 10 feet in front of him and 8 feet below, Lieutenant Gage had not moved. He had his eye at the rubber cup of the Norden bombsight. He had his hands on the drift knobs. He had adjusted for wind and altitude, and ground speed, and rate of closure, to target 357 12 times in the last hour and a half, and he was not going to stop adjusting now. Musashino was still hidden under cloud. The alternate target was the industrial waterfront at Hamamatsu, and Hamamatsu was coming up beneath the nose. He whispered into his throat microphone, "Steady," and Avery held the crippled bomber steady on a bombing run that no manual in any air force in the world had ever imagined a pilot could hold. The bomb bay doors opened. 12 500-pound general-purpose bombs tumbled out into the freezing air. Gage said, "Bombs away." He said, "Doors closing." He said, "For God's sake, turn." Avery turned as gently as a man carrying an open bowl of water. The left wing was 10 feet shorter than the right wing along its outer edge. The left aileron was half gone. The left flap was half gone. Any turn to the left could tear the wing off. Any turn too sharp to the right could put the bomber into a spin she would not recover from at 29,000 feet. He fed in right rudder in small increments and rolled the yoke a quarter of an inch at a time, and Irish Lassie came around slowly, holding her altitude, still in formation with 15 other superfortresses of the 497th. The fighters kept coming. From 2 o'clock, from 4 o'clock, from directly astern, from directly above, they attacked in pairs and threes and once in a wave of 9 that filled the entire right quarter of the sky at once. Jim McHugh coordinated fire across all 4 turrets, calling target assignments in a voice that stayed level, even as his oxygen mask froze to his cheeks. Marvin Meyer in the right blister fired his twin 50s until the barrels glowed. In the tail, Mulligan tracked one Ki-45 through a diving pass from 6 o'clock high and saw its engine come apart in his sights. He tracked a Ki-44 across the beam and saw its wing crumple. He tracked a Ki-61 through a slow curving attack from behind and below and saw its canopy explode. He had been in the tail compartment for 22 minutes. He had claimed 3 fighters. The intercom was full of voices calling out targets. McHugh's voice reading ranges. Meyer's voice calling out a Tojo at 8 o'clock. Avery's voice acknowledging warnings from the flight engineer about temperatures on the number 2 engine. The voice of the navigator, quiet, reading course corrections from a chart he could no longer keep on his table because the table had frozen over. The intercom was full of the sound of 40 men across the formation trying to live. At 14:20 hours, the second fighter came for Irish Lassie's tail. Mulligan saw it late. It was coming from directly above and behind, diving at an angle so steep that it was almost falling. Its propeller was still turning. Its guns were silent. The pilot was not shooting because the pilot had run out of ammunition, or because the pilot had never loaded any ammunition to begin with, and Mulligan understood in the last 3 seconds of his warning that the fighter was going to hit him. He fired everything he had. The Ki-61 flew directly through the stream of 50 caliber rounds. Pieces broke off it. The engine took hits, the canopy cracked, and it kept coming. It struck Irish Lassie's tail at just under 300 miles an hour. The impact took off the entire left horizontal stabilizer. It took off the entire left half of the tail gunner's compartment. It took off Mulligan's twin 50s, his ammunition boxes, his oxygen line, his intercom cable, and the outer wall of his position. It did not take off Mulligan. He was strapped into a seat that stayed bolted to what remained of the tail structure. He was suddenly sitting in the open sky at 28,000 feet, in temperatures of 55 degrees below zero, hearing nothing but wind, seeing the tumbling wreckage of a Japanese fighter fall past his legs and disappear into cloud below. The Ki-61 that hit him spun down out of control for perhaps 4,000 feet, then its pilot bailed out. Captain Kobayashi Teruhiko's parachute opened at 22,000 feet over the town of Tachikawa, 6 miles from the target Irish Lassie had just failed to bomb. He drifted down through the freezing air with minor bruises on his forehead and along both legs. He landed in a snow-covered rice field. Local police reached him within the hour. By nightfall, he would be back at Chofu, writing his report. He had just tried to kill a man roughly his own age, and had almost succeeded, and neither of them would ever know the other's name. Up in the cockpit of Irish Lassie, Lieutenant Avery felt the nose of the airplane drop violently and yaw hard to the left. Half the tail was gone. Most of the elevator control cables were gone. The rudder cables were gone. The trim system was gone. He had 2 engines running on the right wing and 1 engine running on the left wing, and no way to make the airplane point where he wanted it to point, except by adjusting the throttles of those 3 engines individually, adding power on one side and cutting power on the other side, to yaw the fuselage around the ruined tail. He said one word into the intercom. He said everyone. He said it the way a man says a name in an empty room. The flight engineer read out fuel and altitude and airspeed and heading, and Avery listened to numbers he could not fix and pulled the aircraft into a slow, wallowing descent toward the south. 1,500 miles of ocean lay between Irish Lassie and Isley Field. He had no rudder. He had no left aileron. He had no elevator trim. He had 1.5 functioning wings and 3 engines, and a tail gunner still alive in an open compartment behind him, and a bombardier alive in the nose, and a co-pilot alive to his right, and a crew he was going to try to bring home. At the same moment, 40 miles to the east, over open water, 3 other superfortresses of the 497th Bomb Group were breaking up in mid-air. Ghastly Goose was on fire from the wing route inward, and going down under attack from a Key 44, flown by Corporal Ando, who was flying a ramming approach identical to Kobayashi's and would live to see it work. Captain Dale Peterson would ride Ghastly Goose into the sea. The bomber called Thumper was heading east with a single Kai-61 called Tony chasing it, and neither Thumper nor its Tony would be seen again by American eyes. 2 other superfortresses whose crews had been friends of Avery's, in training back at Great Bend, Kansas, were spiraling down under Japanese fighter cover, with their crews trapped inside them. 9 B-29s did not come home from the 27th of January mission. 78 American airmen died over Japan that afternoon. At Isley Field, the mission board would show most of their names in chalk by 10 o'clock that night, and here is what the newspapers would not print for another 18 months. Somewhere over Musashino, at 14:30 local time, the American gunners of the 497th Bomb Group finished the day believing they had shot down close to 100 Japanese fighters. The gunners of Irish Lassie alone would eventually be credited with 14. Collier's magazine would publish the number in July of 1946. 14 enemy aircraft, 1 bomber, 1 mission. It would become one of the most famous kill claims of the Pacific War. The claim was made in good faith. But claims made by bomber gunners in the middle of a running fight, when 40 fighters attack 12 bombers over the course of 40 minutes, and every gunner from every crew is firing at every target that crosses his sight, do not survive contact with the archives. When a single Key 44 falls out of the sky in front of Irish Lassie, and Marvin Meyer sees it fall, and the gunner in the next superfortress sees it fall, and a waist gunner 3 planes back also sees it fall, all 3 of them are going to log the kill. Cross-checking against Japanese loss records, when historians finally got the records after the war, showed that American gunners across the entire Exec-1 Bomber Command overclaimed enemy losses by a wide margin for the entire strategic bombing campaign. That does not make Irish Lassie's crew less brave, it makes them men. Kobayashi Teruhiko was still alive. Sergeant Major Isamu Sakamoto of the 47th Sentai, who had also rammed a B-29 that afternoon, was also still alive. The rest of the Japanese pilots, who had climbed to intercept the Musashino strike, were not accounted for cleanly in any surviving document, and the truth about how many of them had actually died over Tokyo on the 27th of January was something no gunner on either side would ever be allowed to know. And there was one more thing that no one aboard Irish Lassie could yet see. Most of the bombs the 497th had carried to Japan that morning had not fallen on the primary target at all. The clouds had held. Hamamatsu had taken most of the tonnage. What that meant for the war would not become clear for another 6 weeks. Irish Lassie was 1,500 miles from home, missing half her tail, missing 1 engine, leaking fuel from the left wing, carrying a tail gunner freezing in an open compartment, and turning south over water that would not warm above 40 degrees for another 4 months. The men aboard her did not yet know their aircraft would break in half on the runway at Saipan. They did not yet know all of them would live. They did not yet know what a 58-year-old Air Force general named Curtis LeMay was already writing on a legal pad in a Quonset hut at Guam, and what he would decide to do about it 41 days from now. They only knew what the flight engineer told them, in the calm voice of a man who has run out of adjectives. He said, "We're going to try." The Pacific Ocean at 15,000 feet in January of 1945 was a colour no photograph has ever quite captured. It was the colour of slate under a coat of frost. It reached from horizon to horizon in every direction, and it did not care whether an airplane crossed it, or fell into it, or came apart 3,000 feet above it. Irish Lassie was pointed south into 1,500 miles of that ocean, and the flight engineer had just said the only true thing left to say. "We're going to try." Lieutenant Lloyd Avery held the yoke with both hands and did not look down. The bomber flew at a shallow angle to level, nose down about 2 degrees, left wing low about 6 degrees, tail dragging slightly because half of it was not there anymore. She wanted to roll left. She wanted to yaw left. She wanted to descend. Avery corrected each of those with a different combination of throttle settings on the 3 engines still turning. Number 1 on the left wing was gone. Numbers 2, 3, and 4 were running rough but running. He kept the 2 right side engines at slightly higher power than number 2 on the left, and the asymmetric thrust kept the bomber crabbing sideways through the air along something close to a straight line. He would fly that way for 8 hours. Behind the cockpit, in what remained of the tail compartment, Sergeant Charles Mulligan was still alive. His oxygen line had been torn out by the impact. He had switched to the emergency walk-around bottle, strapped to his chest, and given himself perhaps 40 minutes of air. The outer wall of his position was gone. He was sitting in a metal chair, bolted to a piece of aluminum frame, facing an open sky at 55 degrees below zero, staring at the tumbling wake of an airplane he could not feel and could barely hear over the wind. The intercom cable had been severed. He had no way to talk to anyone in the front of the bomber. He did not know if they knew he was alive. He waited. McHugh crawled back through the connecting tunnel 40 minutes later, dragging a spare oxygen bottle and a length of intercom wire, and found him. The 2 men did not speak much. McHugh spliced a new intercom line by twisting the wires together with his gloved fingers and holding them in place with electrical tape from the emergency kit. He plugged Mulligan into the walk-around bottle. He clapped the tail gunner once on the shoulder and crawled back forward through the tunnel, 30 feet of unpressurized darkness, hand over hand, the way a sailor moves along the deck of a ship in a storm. When he reached the flight deck, he keyed his microphone and said, "Mulligan's alive." Avery closed his eyes for 1 second. Then he opened them and went back to flying the airplane. The navigator, working over a chart he had spread across his knees, a table was covered in ice, gave a course of 170 degrees magnetic, 1,512 miles to Isley Field. At the current true airspeed of 160 knots, that was 9 hours and 20 minutes of flying. The flight engineer read out the fuel state. There was enough for 8 hours, maybe a little less, if the left wing kept leaking at the rate the co-pilot could see through his side window. Aviation gasoline was streaming from the ruptured tank in a thin silver line that the freezing air pulled straight back and vaporized before it fell. The mathematics were simple. They were not going to make it. They kept flying anyway. 2 hours south, the sun sank into the Pacific behind the right wing, and the sky went the color of a bruise, and then the color of iron, and then the color of nothing at all. There were no lights on the aircraft. The electrical system had been damaged by fighter fire and by the second ramming impact. The flight engineer had shut down every non-essential circuit an hour earlier to reduce the load on the remaining generators. The instrument panels glowed only where the radium dials on the primary flight instruments could catch what little starlight came through the shattered plexiglass of the nose. Inside the fuselage, the temperature dropped to 60 below zero and then colder. The men flew in the dark and did not talk. At 210 miles from Saipan, roughly 6 hours into the return flight, the number 2 engine on the left wing began to run rough. Cylinder head temperatures climbed into the yellow arc and stayed there. Oil pressure fluctuated. The flight engineer reached for the mixture controls to lean the engine and gain a few more minutes of endurance. And when he did that, Avery understood something he had been refusing to understand for 2 hours. The engine was going to fail. When it failed, the left wing would carry no thrust at all. The bomber would yaw so hard to the left that the 2 remaining engines on the right wing would not be able to hold her straight. The asymmetric thrust would spin her into the ocean before anyone could reach a parachute. He said one thing on the intercom. He said, "Get ready." He did not say ready for what. Every man on Irish Lassie already knew. At 2200 hours local time, 70 miles north of Saipan, the fuel warning light on the number 2 engine came on and stayed on. The engine coughed, caught, coughed again. The flight engineer switched to the emergency crossfeed valve and pumped the last of the fuel for Lutty from the right-wing tanks over to the failing left engine. The engine ran smooth for 11 minutes. The right-wing tanks went dry. The engine coughed, caught, ran. Isley Field appeared on the horizon at 22:40 as a single line of blue landing lights along the surface of an island. Avery began the approach at 3,000 feet and dropped it to 2,000. There were no hydraulics. The landing gear had to be cranked down by hand. The flight engineer and the radio operator worked the emergency gear extension system for 11 minutes, one turn at a time, and got all 3 wheels locked down. What the crew did not know, and could not see, was that fighter cannon fire had compromised the structural mounts of the nose gear during the 3rd attack over Musashino. She would land on damaged landing gear, half a tail, 1.5 wings, and 3 engines at midnight on a coral runway in the middle of the Mariana Islands, and Avery lined her up on final approach at 90 knots and held the yoke steady with his knees while his hands worked the throttles. The main gear touched first, the nose wheel touched second and collapsed under the weight. The nose slammed into the coral. The forward fuselage ploughed forward, decelerating in a shriek of aluminum against crushed rock. The stress travelled backward along the airframe until it reached the weakened wing structure and the ruined tail, and the superfortress broke in, 2 just behind the wing. The forward half of Irish Lassie skidded another 600 feet on its belly and stopped. The rear half stopped 40 feet behind it. For perhaps 3 seconds nobody inside her moved. Then the escape hatch on the top of the cockpit opened, and Lloyd Avery pulled himself out onto the roof of a bomber that no longer resembled the aircraft he had signed for that morning, and he counted his men as they climbed out one by one behind him. The bombardier, Gage, the co-pilot, the navigator, the flight engineer, the radio operator, the 2 blister gunners, Meyer and the left waist, the radar operator, Jim McHugh from the central fire control station, and out of the ruptured stub of what had been the tail compartment, 40 feet behind the rest of them, Charles Mulligan of Henderson, Kentucky, walking on his own 2 feet across the coral toward the rest of the crew. 11 men, nobody dead, nobody left behind. Irish Lassie was declared a total loss on the maintenance report the following morning. The forward fuselage was hauled off the runway and pushed into the salvage yard at the end of Isley Field. The rear fuselage was cannibalized for parts. Within a week she was gone, converted into replacement panels for other superfortresses that would fly other missions to other targets under other crews. The 497th Bomb Group received the Distinguished Unit Citation for the 27th of January mission. The awards ceremony was held 6 weeks later. Avery accepted the citation on behalf of a crew that would not fly together again. The bomber they had flown was gone. The war was moving faster than they were, and there is one more thing you should know. You should know that Target 357 was still standing when Avery accepted his citation. The Nakajima Aircraft Company engine plant at Musashino had not been destroyed on the 27th of January. It had barely been damaged. The clouds over the primary target had saved it. 9 more high-altitude precision bombing missions would be flown against Musashino between January and April of 1945, and none of them would achieve the destruction the 21st Bomber Command had promised. The Nakajiman engineers, seeing what was coming, dispersed engine production to a factory at Hamamatsu and to an underground facility carved into a hillside. Ha-45 engines continued to come off the assembly lines. Japanese fighters continued to climb toward incoming superfortresses. The strategic bombing campaign was not working. Curtis LeMay had assumed command of the 21st Bomber Command on the 20th of January, 7 days before the Musashino raid. He was 38 years old. He was famously blunt, famously ambitious, and famously willing to be hated by his own airmen if it meant winning the war. He had come from the China-Burma-India theatre, where he had already tried and largely failed to prove that high-altitude precision bombing could work against Japan. He had read the mission reports from November, December, and the first 3 weeks of January. He had counted the crashed superfortresses and the dead crews. He had looked at the reconnaissance photographs of intact Japanese factories and drawn the conclusion no West Point instructor had ever wanted him to draw. The doctrine was not working. The doctrine was going to have to change. Between the end of January and the middle of February, LeMay ordered a series of test missions and studied a series of maps. He read a paper on the incendiary bombing of Chongqing by the Japanese in 1939 and a paper on the incendiary bombing of Hankou by American bombers in December of 1944. He looked at the density of wooden construction in the residential districts of Tokyo. He looked at the wind patterns over Honshu in March. He calculated the tonnage of magnesium and napalm his super fortresses could carry if he stripped out their defensive armament and flew them at 5,000 feet instead of 30,000. He made his decision in the first week of March. On the night of the 9th and 10th of March 1945, more than 300 super fortresses of the 21st Bomber Command took off from Saipan, Tinian, and Guam and flew north at low altitude in single file with almost no defensive guns and a full load of incendiary bombs. They bombed 16 square miles of central Tokyo. They killed approximately 100,000 civilians in a single night. The fires burned so hot that the air above the city rose in a column that shook the tail sections of the last B-29s to leave the target. The mission was called Meeting House. It was the beginning of a new war. 41 days separated the 27th of January from Meeting House. In those 41 days, the strategic air war in the Pacific stopped being an argument about doctrine and started being something else. It is not accurate to say that Irish Lassie caused that change. The 27th of January was one mission out of many. LeMay had already begun questioning high-altitude precision bombing before the Musashino strike. What is accurate to say is that Irish Lassie was part of the evidence. Her crew, and the 78 American airmen who died alongside them that afternoon, and the intact factory they had failed to destroy, and the 400 bombers the 21st Bomber Command had already lost or written off since November, together made up the case that ended one American air doctrine and started another one. The men who flew Meeting House did not fly superfortresses, the way the men who flew to Musashino had flown them. They flew stripped-down bombers with fewer gunners and different bomb loads at altitudes that would have been considered suicidal in December. They flew a different war. Somewhere in Tokyo on the night of the 9th of March, in the smoke and the wind above the burning city, Captain Kobayashi Teruhiko took off in his Kawasaki Ki-61 to intercept a bomber stream he could not stop. He flew against the superfortresses until August. He survived the war. In 1954, at the age of 33, he joined the newly created Japan Air Self-Defense Force, and he retired as a senior officer many years later. He never met Lloyd Avery. Avery survived the war. Charles Mulligan returned to Henderson, Kentucky. Marvin Meyer returned to Boone, Iowa. Jim McHugh, like the rest of them, went home to a country that thanked its bomber crews briefly and then moved on. The Distinguished Unit citation hung on 11 different walls in 11 different American towns. The story of Irish Lassie appeared in Collier's magazine in July of 1946, under the headline that credited 14 enemy fighters to a single bomber crew on a single mission. It was a good story. It was told the way Americans in 1946 needed stories told. Nobody printed the part about Musashino still standing. Nobody printed the part about Meeting House either. The men who had been there did not need it printed. They already knew. 1,500 miles of Black Ocean lay behind them on the night of the 27th of January. 41 days of history lay ahead of them, waiting to be written by other men in other cockpits over the same city they had failed to bomb. And in the space between those two things, between the ocean and the fire, 11 Americans walked away from a broken airplane at Isley Field, in the dark, on a coral runway, lit by the headlights of ambulances that had not been needed after all. They were alive. They were also, in a way that took most of them the rest of their lives to understand, the last men to fly a certain kind of war.